Welcome to Studyclix Explains, where we provide audio notes and analysis on junior cycle and Leaving Cert topics to get you those top marks. We make exams easier.
Hi everyone, and welcome to this Studyclix podcast on the poet Emily Dickinson. My name is Peter and I'm an English teacher. I've also got a channel on YouTube called Mr. Tobin Leaving Cert English, so be sure to check that out for more free resources and videos after you've listened to this podcast. So together, we're going to take a look at Emily Dickinson's background, what makes her poetry special, and examine some of the poems that have been chosen for the Leaving Cert syllabus. Now, Dickinson is one of those poets that people have often heard about without really knowing anything in detail about her, or even any of her work. Her reputation as a recluse, someone who always wore white and who rarely left her own room, let alone her father's house, has almost taken over from her poetry. But there's really a lot more to her than that. So what do we know about her? Well, Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts on the 10th of December 1830. Her father, Edward Dickinson, was a lawyer, and Emily was the second of three children. Her brother, Austin, 1 year older than her, and her sister, Lavinia, 3 years younger than her. They were a very close-knit family, with Emily and Lavinia in particular being constant companions for Emily's entire life. Emily was well educated, and it was something that her father put a great deal of emphasis on. He wanted his children, his daughters as well as his son, to benefit from a good education, and Emily attended Amherst Academy, which was known as a progressive school for the time, as well as Mount Holyoke Female Seminary after she finished in Amherst Academy. She left the seminary after less than a year, and there's lots of speculation about the reasons why. In her letters, she talks of her extreme homesickness and illness, but it seems likely to have been her father's concern about her health. Edward Dickinson's main worry for his children was their health. It makes sense in some ways, considering that this was a time before antibiotics and a time of a general lack of understanding about how germs and disease spread. His letters to his children are full of warnings about avoiding sickness and wrapping up well and not going out in bad weather. He even advises them not to go to school if the weather's too bad. Now, the biggest threat of all in that time was tuberculosis, or TB, which was also known as consumption. So this was a lung disease that was responsible for widespread death in large parts of Europe, the United States, and elsewhere around the world. It's reported that it was responsible for 22% of all deaths in Massachusetts, the state that Emily lived in, during the mid-19th century. And even by the end of that century, TB was still the leading cause of death in America. Despite concerns from her father, and sometimes from herself, that Emily was consumptive or showing signs of TB, she did not develop the disease. But that's not to say that the Dickinsons were untouched by it. Many of Dickinson's friends and relatives died, not just from TB either, including her cousin and close friend Sophie Holland, who died when she was only 15. That was just a year older than Dickinson at that time, who helped to keep watch over her cousin on her deathbed. So it's no surprise then that much of Dickinson's poetry shows a fascination with death as well as the afterlife. There is a point somewhere in Dickinson's mid to late 20s where she begins to retreat from the world. There are many potential reasons for this, but most of the speculation centres around a love rejection, maybe mental illness, depression, and even possible epilepsy. Now, regardless of what the root cause was, we do know that she began to avoid social interactions and situations, and she rarely left her home, later even rarely leaving her own room. There is a mention at her father's funeral years later that she stayed in her room and just left the door open while the service was going on downstairs. Now, this does not mean that she was isolated, however, and much of what we know about Dickinson comes from her letters. She wrote frenetically to family and friends and acquaintances and even friends of friends. We see through these letters, at least the ones that survived, a really remarkable person. She cultivates long-lasting friendships with people and sometimes scaring off others with her intensity. From her letters, there's a clear sense of someone who is intimately in tune with nature. She writes often of birds, flowers, weather, clouds, rain, anything else in her immediate environment, often using nature to capture some element of emotion or even simply the passing of time. We also see someone who can't help being emotional and sensitive, sometimes even embarrassing herself with her enthusiasm. In one letter to a couple that she wrote to frequently, the Bowleses, a husband and wife, she says, "I should like to thank dear Mrs. Bowles for the little book, except my cheek is red with shame because I write so often. Even the lilies of the field have their dignities." And in another letter, she asks that they use the paper that she writes on to light their lamps, so that she shall not have lived, as she says, in vain. So we get the sense of somebody who is really aware that she is maybe writing too often or saying too much, but she cannot help herself. In a letter to her cousin, Louise Norcross, she writes, "For you remember, dear, you are one of the ones from whom I do not run away." Yet later, in a letter to the same cousin, she shows this intense disappointment when Louise cancels a visit to the house. She says, "Your letter didn't surprise me, Lou. I brushed away the sleet from my eyes familiar with it, looked again to be sure I read it right, and then took up my work hemming strings from my mother's gown. I think I hemmed faster for knowing you weren't coming. My fingers had nothing else to do. Odd that I, who say no so much, cannot bear to hear it from others." So from her letters, we get this picture of a young woman who is emotional, sensitive, fiercely intelligent, and very honest, both emotionally and intellectually. And from her poems, well, we also get a sense of someone who is deeply in tune with nature, concerned or maybe even fascinated with death, but also someone who is innovative, subversive, and she pushes the boundaries of how poetry is written and what poetry can be about. Dickinson's style and form is very distinctive. We can recognise a Dickinson poem very easily by her use of capitalisation and how her poems sound. So take the second stanza of "Hope is the Thing with Feathers," for example. It goes, "And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm." Here we can see, or even hear if you don't have it in front of you, what's happening. So the last word of the first line, heard, is rhyming with the last line of the third line, bird, while the last word of the second line, storm, is close rhyming with the last word of the fourth line, warm. Now these 4-line stanzas are called quatrains, and what we also notice is that the number of syllables alternates every second line. So in that first and third line, there are 8 syllables, and in the second and fourth lines, there are 6. We call these lines tetrameter, so 8 syllables means there are 4 pairs. Tetra is 4, so that is a tetrameter line. And trimeter, 6 syllables, 3 pairs, and so it's trimeter. And the overall name for this style of poetry is common or ballad meter. Now, the poetic tradition up to this point was generally based on iambic pentameter, lines with 10 syllables. So think Shakespeare and poets like William Wordsworth. So what Dickinson was really doing was quite revolutionary with her metre, and it was directly inspired by the hymns that she would have been hearing as a girl growing up in the First Church of Amherst, the church that her parents attended. Aside from the metre, there are some other notable features of Dickinson's poetry that make it really stand out. So Dickinson is celebrated for her concision. What this means is that she condenses language by removing what she believes to be unnecessary words. This allows her to pack really complex or big ideas into short lines or phrases. Her use of concision is almost like a grenade. It's small and packed really tight, but when it explodes, kind of like when an idea explodes in the reader's mind, it has a massive impact. Another of Dickinson's standout features is her use of dashes and other non-traditional punctuation. She uses dashes to connect ideas, but also to end lines, giving a sense of incompleteness in places. This works in different ways, so at the end of a poem, the use of the dash leaves the poem with that sense of incompleteness, even a sense of unknowableness, something Dickinson probably felt herself, and she intended that the reader feel too. The dash used more generally indicates a separation between thoughts and ideas. It shows the connection between ideas as well as giving a reader space and time to fully appreciate and contemplate those ideas. There are, of course, a whole host of other techniques and tools that Dickinson uses. She uses alliteration, onomatopoeia, striking metaphors and similes, personification, as well as others, and we'll see examples of these when we look at her poems individually. Although Dickinson's style is distinctive and fairly easy to recognise, it does not mean that it's easy to understand. Dickinson was well aware that there are some aspects of human experience, whether positive or negative, that are incredibly difficult to capture with words alone. Dickinson challenges the reader through her concision and figurative language to see what she sees and feel what she feels. Before we look at some of Dickinson's poems, let's take a look at some of the themes that you're going to encounter in them. One of the most prominent ideas in both her letters and her poetry is death and the afterlife. As we've heard already, death was an ever-present in Dickinson's time and something that came to the young as well as the old. She would have had experience of her peers dying, both family and friends in school, and at one stage she lived next to a cemetery, which would have been a very busy place indeed. She would have been able to see all the comings and goings and funerals on a daily basis. In one of her letters she says, "I notice where death has been introduced he frequently calls, making it desirable to forestall his advances." It seems that the exploration of death in her poetry is actually more a consideration of what comes after death rather than death itself. So sometimes Dickinson has earned a reputation as being morbid or focused entirely on death and funerals and what happens in funerals. There are references in both "I heard a fly buzz when I died" and "I felt a funeral in my brain" to the process of dying. So in one poem it's the deathbed and on the other it's the funeral service. But both poems build to the point of the lack of consciousness or sense at the end. In "I heard a fly buzz," the speaker cannot see to see, while in "I felt a funeral in my brain," the speaker finished knowing then. So it's more focus on what comes after the moment of death. In both of these poems, some of her most famous that deal directly with death, there is a fascination or a fear of that moment, what is coming afterwards. It is the great unknown. We can't know what happens after that point, regardless of what it is that we believe. Now, Dickinson had her troubles with religion, faith, and God even. She was not as convinced as her other family members were, and not as strong in her faith as they were. In her letters, she regularly questions God, and when she was a girl in school, she was ostracised for not reaffirming her Calvinist faith as other people in the town were doing, her father included. So what is often described then as her fascination with death could well be more to do with her terror of what happens after death. The act of dying, as described in many of her poems, is a sad reflection of the familiarity she had with death. But no matter how many loved ones are lost, it's impossible to know for certain where they have gone, what happens after they're gone, and whether she will ever see them again. Another of Dickinson's more famous themes is one with two sides, hope and despair. Now, Dickinson had struggles with her mental health. While it's impossible to know for certain, and it's probably even unhelpful to try to diagnose her, there are clear signs that she suffered at times with anxiety and depression or despair. On the flip side, there are also moments of hope, exhilarating hope in some cases, and these are often allied with nature and images from the natural world. This despair, in some cases, is linked to her fear or uncertainty around the afterlife. In some of her poems, such as "The Soul Has Bandaged Moments" and "There's a Certain Slant of Light," we get a sense of the depths of this despair and the long-lasting effects of it. We know that people who suffer from depression can often have moments where the depression lifts and they feel relatively normal. But there is always the knowledge that they can go back to that place, that dark place. In a way, they are scarred by their experience. Dickinson explores this particular idea quite well, and she also acknowledges the isolation and the loneliness that comes as part of depression or mental illness. Dickens isolated herself from most people anyway, so when she had these periods of mental anguish, her sense of loneliness must have been overwhelming. She also captures the numbness that comes with her mental distress, and as someone who knows what it feels like when she is in the depths of despair, she celebrates the highs of hope in poems such as "Hope is the Thing with Feathers" and, paradoxically, "The Soul Has Bandaged Moments." Even the first line, the use of that word "moments," hints that there is some reprieve, some release from these difficult times, even if it is brief. The final theme that we'll mention here is much larger than a theme, really. Dickinson's use of nature is ever present. She is so in tune with the natural world. Again, in her letters, it is weaved seamlessly through her experience of the world that it really underpins everything that she says. So when she explores loneliness, or despair, or hope, or happiness, or love, or pain, even her moments of fun and humour. All of it is done through the lens of the natural world. To capture the idea of hope, she uses a bird, for example. To communicate the idea of despair, she uses the light. Nature is to the fore in other poems like A Narrow Fellow in the Grass and I Tasted Liquor Never Brewed. The natural world is something Dickinson has an intimate understanding of, and she finds ways to use nature to speak her feelings and concerns. Now, we're going to look at each of Dickinson's poems in turn. You will have studied them in great detail in school, so I'm going to just give a brief summary, and then I'm going to point to some of the more interesting ideas and features that you might mention if you were answering a Leaving Cert essay question on Dickinson in your exam. So the first poem we're going to look at is Hope is the Thing with Feathers. Now this is probably one of the more straightforward of Dickinson's poems. It's often described as a naming or definition poem. Dickinson is trying to pin down and identify what something is, in this case, hope. The poem is hopeful in tone and theme. Dickinson uses a metaphor to compare hope to a tiny bird that sings and sings without stopping. Even when times are difficult, when there are storms raging, and even in the farthest reaches of the world, hope sings. It exists. It's a wonderful thought, really, that hope cannot be extinguished, and the final line too is very hopeful. Hope never asks anything in return. Even in the most dire of circumstances, it is unconditional. When we examine Dickinson's style here, we see the familiar use of capitalisation on common nouns such as gale, bird and extremity, and we see those dashes throughout. The poem, however, does not end on a dash, giving us a proper sense of closure, that Dickinson had something she could say for certain, that hope is everlasting. One final note on this poem is that although its subject is hope and it is often referred to as an inspirational poem, there is a hint of a paradox here. In stanza 1, the speaker says that it never stops, while in stanza 2, it says, "Sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird." Now, the word abash doesn't simply mean to stop or silence someone or something, it means to embarrass or shame them as well. So on one hand, hope is everlasting, while on the other, it can be stopped, but only in extreme or sore circumstances. It's also worth remembering that hope itself does not mean the person with it isn't suffering. Having hope can get you through difficult times, yes, but it doesn't erase the pain. Now, the critic Helen Wendler points to the rhyming in stanza 2 between the words storm and warm as a clue to this. She calls this rhyming antithetical because the words warm and storm have opposite connotations, and she says that this emphasises the paradoxical and uncertain power of hope's tune. The next poem that we're going to look at is There's a Certain Slant of Light. This poem, in opposition to Hope is the Thing with Feathers, tries to capture that idea of the quality of light being oppressive or creating a sense of dread or despair. The speaker in this poem equates the winter afternoon light to the oppressive nature of religion as represented by the cathedral bells. This may well echo Dickinson's own uncertainties and discomfort with religion, and especially the oppressive conservatism of Calvinism. There's a great example of Dickinson's concision in stanza 2 when she says, "Heavenly hurt it gives us, we can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are." In these short lines, Dickinson identifies the damage that mental anguish, despair or depression can do without leaving visible scars. While also pointing towards a possible reason for the pain, is it born of the mind or is it religion or even God? And where does it cause this hurt? Well, in the brain or the mind, where the meanings are. This is such a good manipulation of language. The meanings that we create are us. It is through the lens of ourselves and our own experience that we define the world around us. We attach meaning to the world and the things that are in it. So for the heavenly hurt to target that part of us is incredibly destructive because the meanings will be affected too. It changes how we see the entire world. So the despair or depression that is inspired by this certain slant of light affects everything. None may teach it, as we see in the poem, or change it. When it arrives, it is total and unrelenting. Despite the description of total despair, though, there is some hope. The second last line says, "when it goes." But that's quickly followed by, "'tis like the distance on the look of death." Perhaps there really isn't so much relief after all. Now this poem is a little different from many of Dickinson's others on the Leaving Cert syllabus because of the metre and the rhyme. Here they have been deliberately changed. We saw previously that Dickinson most commonly wrote in ballad metre, also known as common metre. In that metre, the first and third lines have 8 syllables in 4 pairs and we call that tetrametre, while the second and fourth lines have 6 syllables in 3 pairs and we call that trimetre. This metre often creates a sing-song quality, which generally suits a poem that is positive, such as Hope is the Thing with Feathers, while it feels less appropriate in a poem like this, There's a Certain Slant of Light. Here, in the first 3 stanzas, the first and third line of each quatrain have 6 or 7 syllables, while the second and fourth lines generally have 5. The fourth and final stanza returns to the full 8 syllables, or tetrametre, for the first and third lines, while the second and fourth lines persist with that 5-syllable line. While this is a small or maybe even a marginal difference in metre, it is definitely deliberate. And a deliberate choice by a poet is always worth commenting on. So what was Dickinson trying to say or suggest here? Similarly, there's a clear rhyme between the second and fourth lines of each stanza all the way through the poem. Afternoons, tunes, scar, are, despair, air, breath, death. While the rhyme is much looser but still present between the first and the third lines, we would call it imperfect rhyme. And it often connects with one consonant or a sibilant S sound, so light, heft, us, difference, any, affliction, and listens, distance. Again, what is Dickinson trying to communicate or emphasise through this use of imperfect rhyme and dislocated metre? It could very well be that she is trying to give us a sense of the despair and unease that the quality of light she describes in the poem is making her feel. She does this through not giving the listener or the reader what they want, that clean, easy rhyme and rhythm that we expect from her, that we find in her other poems. Now we're going to move on to one of Dickinson's more famous, but also more challenging poems, I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. One of the biggest challenges in this poem is that there are so many ways of interpreting or unpacking the dense and concise language that is used. It's clear that some sort of collapse, either mental or physical, is being described. The opening line is so disconcerting. How can someone feel a funeral in their brain? But this word brain in line 1 is really important. Just like in Hope is the Thing with Feathers, where Dickinson tries to pin down or define what hope is, here she is trying to identify where this suffering she is feeling is located. In line 1, she says she feels it in her brain. In stanza 2, she says it's in her soul, while in stanza 3, she says it's her being. This tracks her suffering from being physical to psychological to a total, all-encompassing type of suffering. She's headed for total collapse. There is, of course, also the references to religion through the service and the bells, and these could well be hints at her frustration and intolerance of the conservatism of Calvinism, the constant badgering of the congregation about sins and wrongdoing and hell. The metaphor of the funeral itself is extended throughout the poem, with the mourners and their footsteps a constant presence. This, of course, plays up to the Dickinson reputation as being focused on death, but it's more a spiritual or psychological death that is being explored here. Interestingly, when it was published in 1896, the publishers left out that last stanza altogether, preferring the poem to end on the line, "Wrecked solitary here." The final stanza underlines the all-encompassing nature of the breakdown that we mentioned a moment ago. Reason has broken and the speaker has plunged into unknowingness. The end of the poem, then followed by a dash, is abrupt and unsettling and hints at the unknowable nature of the afterlife. In 1896, her editors might have preferred not to have these sorts of questions raised when good Calvinists were supposed to be sure of their own salvation and their ascension to heaven. Dickinson makes clear with her ending here that, for her at least, those questions and answers are not clear-cut. A final point on this poem on the metre. We've seen in some of the poems already that Dickinson can be quite flexible in her metre and rhyme, but this poem is rigid in its alternation between tetrametre and trimetre, with one exception. That critic Helen Vendler that we mentioned a moment ago, well, in this poem she identifies this exception as being line 5, which, if it followed the pattern, should be tetrametre, but instead it is a trimetre as the drum of the service interrupts the narrative. According to Vendler then, if Dickinson had not made the metre so insistently percussive, we would not feel the funeral that she felt. Now this is yet another example of Dickinson's mastery of language and form and her great skill as a poet. The next poem we're going to look at is A Bird Came Down the Walk. A Bird Came Down the Walk is one of Dickinson's poems that both personify and defamiliarise nature in order to capture something deeper. In this poem, the speaker observes a bird that doesn't know it's being watched. The bird finds a worm and quickly bites it with its beak and swallows it down. He then drinks from a dewdrop, steps aside to let a beetle pass, and then, when the speaker approaches, flies away. So what is the deeper thing in this poem then? Well, from the perspective of rhyme and metre, it's fairly straightforward. Classic Dickinson. Regular ballad metre with an A-B-C-B rhyme scheme. The poetic skill comes in the defamiliarisation of the bird, something most people might encounter every day, to make it seem like something almost magical. And this defamiliarisation is coupled with an exquisite use of metaphor to show us that despite the savagery and primal needs of nature, such as a bird devouring a worm without thought or hesitation, there is also a rare beauty that is communicated in the final lines as the bird flies away. The metaphor of the bird unrolling his feathers and rowing through the air like a boat rowing across the ocean also makes great use of assonance, the repetition of a vowel sound. So listen for the O sound repeated in the words rolled, rowed, home, oars, ocean. It's a soft sound, almost emphasising the beauty of the natural world, and then followed by the gentle image of the butterflies playing in the afternoon, making no sound, plashless. This poem then counterpoints the savagery of nature with the beauty of it, and it's clear which one lasts longer in the memory of the reader. For sure in this poem, and probably for Dickinson generally, beauty wins out. Another of the more famous Dickinson poems, I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died, deals with the moment of death, and as we've seen already, focuses in on the last moments and that transition from this world into whatever it is that comes afterwards. It's worth remembering that this deathbed scene that is described in the poem is one that Dickinson would, unfortunately, have been familiar with. She watched over her cousin, Sophie Holland, as she died when Dickinson was only 14. She also nursed both her mother and her father in their dying days. This poem then details the final moments of the speaker. In fact, the opening line is being delivered from the afterlife, whatever or wherever that is. The stillness in the room comes after the body's last struggle for survival and the family's noisy grief. All the tears have been cried, and now there is acceptance, both from the family members and the speaker. Now they are all waiting for the king to come, the king here being death, the one with ultimate control. There is a delay though in stanza 3 when the speaker talks about something that seems inconsequential at this point, the will, and the belongings that have all been assigned to other people. And it's at this point that something else entirely inconsequential, a fly, comes between the speaker and this greatest, most monumental of moments, the dying moment. The sense here is of a really annoying fly that is small but noisy and irritating. And for it to come at this moment is almost funny actually, if it wasn't such a serious time. We know that Dickinson is interested in the moment of death and the afterlife, but here at the moment when we all will pay the ultimate price to find out what's on the other side, a fly gets in the way. The fly's blue colour takes over in the last stanza, and as the speaker's eyes fail, all they can hear is the buzz of the fly. Anecdotally, it's been said that the hearing is the last of the senses to go in death, that sometimes people who are on the cusp of death can still hear their loved ones. But in this case, it's not loved ones that are heard, it is that onomatopoeic buzz of a fly. This poem is normalising death. It takes the gravity out of the situation, the seriousness. In some ways, it's actually blasphemous. At that moment when the speaker is supposed to meet their maker, as the Calvinist tradition that she grew up with would suggest, she sees a fly instead, that most inconsequential of creatures, and it is this fly, not God, that dominates this poem from the very first line to the end. The next poem that we're going to look at is The Soul Has Bandaged Moments. To understand this poem, it's also important to understand the genre of Gothic horror. Dickinson is borrowing from a very recognisable set of stereotypes here. The female prisoner, the ugly or villainous goblin, and the sense of dread or horror at what might happen to her. There's a particular and deliberate sense that she may be violated in some way by this goblin. Now, these tropes would have been instantly recognisable to Dickinson and contemporary readers who would have been familiar with Gothic horror stories. But Dickinson subverts this genre and internalises it to make it about mental anguish that is suffered. So the suffering here is internal, it is not coming from some external source. The soul is personified as the female victim that has been captured and imprisoned by a goblin. The female victim is approached by something ghastly that turns out to be a goblin creature. The soul is being approached by anxiety or depression. There is, of course, moments where the soul escapes and is free and joyous, but we see that these moments are just that, moments. The soul, like the woman, is recaptured once again, and we are led to understand that this pattern will repeat itself. There is some hope inherent in the poem as we see the vulnerability of the soul. Perhaps Dickinson was trying to show us how vulnerable we are to non-physical suffering, such as depression and anxiety. The fact that there are moments of both suffering and ecstasy shows us that it's not total despair or overwhelming depression. There is a way out, even if it's just for a while. It's interesting too to note the divergence from her usual metre and stanza form here. There is a sestet, a 6-line stanza, and a couplet. There's 2 lines at the end. It's not just quatrains. When we examine where we get the extra lines in the sestet, for example, we see that it comes after the recognition that that goblin has had an effect on her. These 2 lines to extend the quatrain to a sestet are almost like an apology, that she feels some sort of shame that she has allowed herself to succumb to the goblin. In reality, shame that she is given into depression or anxiety. Now that's quite a modern idea, maybe not so much modern as right now, but 20, 30 years ago, this idea of mental illness being something that people were ashamed of or embarrassed of, people being told to pull themselves together and to get on with things. There is a sense of that shame here in those extra lines that she attaches to that quatrain. And similarly, in the last stanza, we're missing 2 lines. There are only 2 lines there, whereas we expect quatrains from Dickinson. We feel that there should be a more final sense of closure, but we're not given any such comfort. These lines really emphasise the despair felt. Those words, the horror welcomes her again. There is no escape, and the deviation from her usual metre and form underlines that fact. The next poem that we're going to look at is I Could Bring You Jewels Had I a Mind To. This poem, I Could Bring You Jewels Had I a Mind To, is quite playful and a welcome respite, I'm sure, from some of Dickinson's darker, more challenging poems. The poem was sent to Dickinson's brother's wife, Susan Gilbert, so Dickinson's sister-in-law. Although the two lived next door to one another, they wrote to each other extensively. Theirs was a very close relationship. Here the speaker is saying that gift-giving is only really meaningful and true if the gift has special resonance with both the giver and the receiver. At the beginning of the poem, the speaker says they could bring this person all sorts of rare jewels, perfumes, colours, foodstuffs. The places mentioned are all exotic. Bearing in mind that Dickinson barely left her room, let alone her town, going to the Bahamas or San Domingo would be like going to another planet for her. She says that she could bring all of these things, but what would really suit her to give as a gift is a little flower. And it was a particular type of wildflower common in New England, something she would probably have been able to see from her window, called jewel weed. It has tiny orange and yellow flowers with red spots, and Dickinson actually enclosed one of these flowers with the poem that she sent to Susan Gilbert. She says that these flowers suit me more than all the exotic things previously mentioned, and they would even suit as a dowry for Bobadillo, a 16th century Spanish conquistador / governor, and one of the richest men who ever lived. The humour here is evident in that she is describing the value of this flower, and then she seems to imply that this image of the little blaze flickering to itself in the meadow is actually a metaphor for herself. Now, in fairness to Dickinson, a woman who wrote incredible poetry in near total obscurity, it is actually a very fitting symbol for her. A little blaze flickering to itself in the meadow. The next poem that we're going to look at is A Narrow Fellow in the Grass. For a poem that seemingly reveals little about its author, A Narrow Fellow in the Grass can be interpreted in a wide number of ways. So the speaker here is male, a boy at the beginning, and this is something Dickinson has done on a number of occasions in a number of different poems. Using a male speaker gives Dickinson freedom that a girl would not have enjoyed. So, for example, the ability to go around barefoot, for one. The speaker describes a snake in the grass. They always appear suddenly, he says, and can usually only be detected from their effect on their surroundings, like the grass separating as it travels through. They're slippery customers and they're hard to pin down. Now, this boy knows the snake and knows what sort of ground they prefer, the boggy acre. So this in theory should make him safe from snakes because he knows where they're going to be. But he goes on to say that they can actually appear anywhere and sometimes they are disguised. He tells of an experience that has happened more than once when out in the fields he thinks he sees a whiplash lying curled up on the ground, and when he goes to reach for it, he suddenly realises that it's a snake and it slithers away in fright. Now, some of the language used to describe the snake as it wrinkles, and just wonderful, making something that is abhorrent to a lot of people really, really vivid and vibrant. It moves in the way that Dickinson has described. So the first 16 lines are narrated by a boy, but the last 8 lines suddenly feel different and they feel like an adult speaker. So this adult is saying that they like nature and they get on with many of nature's creatures, but since his boyhood, he's never met a snake without experiencing a tightness in his chest and 0 at the bone. Now, this phrase 0 at the bone is an example of how challenging Dickinson's writing can be. There really is no way to translate that phrase. It's a feeling captured in words, but it's a feeling that if you have felt it, then you know what she means. It's a shudder, a total involuntary shudder. It's that moment when you realise that something is on you or in your hair, or you've nearly stepped on something, and it's that moment just after the realisation and you simply react. So it's a combination of revulsion, disgust, fear, adrenaline, and it really is an excellent way of capturing that sensation, 0 at the bone. A final note on this poem brings me back to what I said at the beginning about multiple interpretations. While many people take this poem to be about evil or the devil, using the image of the serpent as a representation of supreme malevolence maybe, I actually get the sense that this poem could be about anyone, especially anyone that you might describe as a snake in the grass, or even just about poisonous snakes. So this was one of the few poems that Dickinson published in her lifetime. So although the editor is The Republican, that was the magazine that it appeared in, they changed her punctuation in line 3, and she said that the poem had been robbed from her. But the fact that she allowed publication, which meant that people would read it and they could read into it, it's safe to assume that she knew that nothing could be read into this. So maybe it is just a poem about snakes and to be careful of them. The next poem that we're going to look at is I Taste a Liquor Never Brewed. It's another of the few that were published in Dickinson's lifetime. The central metaphor in this poem is one of drunkenness, which is ironic considering the time and the town that Dickinson grew up in. The Puritan Christian movement, of which her family were a part, rejected alcohol and encouraged abstinence. This poem, then, can be seen to be poking fun at the temperance movement and revealing Dickinson's own playful side, as well as her views on the Puritan values of her family and that her town espoused. In the poem, it's summertime and the speaker is ecstatic. This ecstasy is not caused by drunkenness or alcohol because the speaker has tasted a liquor never brewed. The last line of stanza 1 emphasises this. The happiness that the speaker feels could not be equalled by drinking wine from the Rhine, a famous wine region in Germany. The extended metaphor continues where bees are being thrown out of pubs for being drunk, butterflies are swearing they'll never drink again, and the speaker says that they will continue to drink more. The speaker is continually travelling upwards, getting higher, if you will, until eventually they are in heaven with the angels and saints. Here perhaps Dickinson is being deliberately sarcastic. Religion and following a religion's rules is supposed to bring you closer to God, but the speaker in this poem is ascending to heaven through overindulgence and going against the Puritan ways. The final image of the tippler, or the drinker, leaning against the sun is reminiscent of a drunk leaning against a lamppost trying to steady themselves. This poem is a great example of Dickinson's playful nature as well as her rebellious side. Now the last poem that we're going to look at is After Great Pain a Form of Feeling Comes. Now this poem is, in my opinion, one of the best of Dickinson's that is on the Leaving Cert syllabus. The poem deals with the aftermath of great emotional pain. The speaker describes the stiff heart that is immobile. It's incapable of any more feeling. The feet move, but it's a mechanical motion, without feeling or attention. The feet aren't even fully aware of what it is that they're walking on. There is some confusion in the speaker too. They appear to be mistaking this numbness for contentment. It's a numbness that is described here as a formal feeling. Now, formal means something done in accordance with rules, convention, or etiquette, and this opens up quite a number of possible interpretations for us. We saw in a previous part of the podcast that Dickinson's use of ballad metre, tetrameter, alternated with trimeter, was a big change from the way poetry was traditionally written. The traditional or formal way poetry was written up to this point was using iambic pentameter, like Shakespeare or William Wordsworth. Dickinson, in this poem, starts off writing exactly in that metre, that traditional old-fashioned metre. The first stanza is written in perfect iambic pentameter. The last two lines of the poem are also written in iambic pentameter. In between, however, in lines 5 to 9, there is chaos. The metre falls apart and looks ragged and all over the place. The critic Helen Wendler says that the formal feeling felt after the great pain seems to be impacting on the order of the poem itself. The formality that person who has suffered is feeling is being reflected in the lines on the page. There is a sense of numbness in the poem following that great pain, but also that the speaker is expected to put on a brave face, that they go through the motions. Now, Wendler argues that it is the tension between inner desperation and outer compliance that generates the ragged middle of this poem. The last stanza offers some qualified hope. We're told that this is the hour of lead. This connects the images of stone and quartz, all heavy, dull, lifeless materials, but it's an hour, suggesting, hopefully, that it will not last forever. And line 11 offers further hope, albeit not really a pleasant one. If you're able to survive this formal feeling, this great pain, then you will remember it. Just like people who very nearly froze to death remember their ordeal. They remember it as coldness, almost near senselessness, and then rescue, or alternatively death. If we take the letting go, that last part of the poem, to mean death, then the speaker is remembering the experience from beyond life, somewhere in the afterlife, just like the speaker in I Heard a Fly Buzz. This brings special resonance to that word if in the line, remembered if outlived. The speaker may not survive this great pain. It is one of the bleaker of Dickinson's poems, but it does capture something of her spirit and her intense skill as a poet. Now, I hope that you found this podcast useful. I really hope that you've gotten something from our exploration of the poems and Dickinson's style and her background. If you are looking for any other resources or videos on the Leaving Cert syllabus, please check out my channel on YouTube, and I hope to talk to you again soon.